Good evening, you're watching World News Tonight on TVP World. I'm Aaron Darman. The US is threatening to walk away from Ukraine peace talks without a deal if both Ukraine and Russia refuse to accept America's terms. So is Crimea a sticking point? More on that in just a moment, but first, the latest headlines. Poland's foreign minister warns Russia away from reigniting its age of imperialism. Apple and Meta are slapped with mega fines under the EU's new digital rules. And tens of thousands of mourners gather to pay their final respects to Pope Francis in Rome. The greatest threat to Poland would be the collapse of the Western community. That was the message from Poland's chief diplomat in the Polish parliament on Wednesday, as he also delivered a blunt warning to Russia to stay within its internationally recognised borders and laid out his foreign policy goals for the coming year. Our reporter Kazimierz Słyszak is there and joins me now. Good evening, Kazimierz. What were the key takeaways from Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski's address?
Good evening, Aaron. There is a lot to unpack, but the number one priority for Poland for the year 2025 when it comes to its foreign policies is definitely security. Security in the context, of course, of the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine happening just beyond Poland's borders. But while Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski spoke at length about Poland's and Europe's security and about the continued support for Ukraine, perhaps one of his strongest comments was actually about Russia. Let's listen.
You will never rule here again, neither in Kyiv, nor in Vilnius, Riga, Tallinn, or Chisinau. Do you not have enough land? 11 time zones, and it's still not enough for you. Focus on better governing what, according to international law, lies within your borders. Instead of fantasizing about conquering Warsaw again, worry about whether you can keep Haishenwai.
Sikorski made several of these jabs at Russia during his speech, but let's come back to the priorities of Poland for 2025 and its foreign policies. These were, like I mentioned, first of all, security, and these priorities haven't really changed since last year, but what has changed is the geopolitical situation in the world. We have a new US President, Donald Trump, who is definitely more blunt in his approach towards Ukraine than his predecessor, and he is also quite critical of the European Union. Still, the US is the number one ally for Poland, so the Polish government now has to navigate this new reality. Let's listen to another comment from the Polish Foreign Minister about Poland's role on the international stage.
The international stage is less predictable than 20 years ago, but Poland is stronger. We are stronger through our memberships in the European Union and NATO. Let's repeat this clearly. Memberships in these alliances are not limiting our sovereignty, but are helping us defend it.
So how has this speech been received here in the Polish parliament? The Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk and Polish President Andrzej Duda were both present at the parliamentary hall. And while the speech received a lot of applause from the center liberal ruling coalition that was expected, what is rather interesting is the fact that he even got some praise from the opposition. Conservative Law and Justice MP Marcin Przydacz talked to me about this earlier today, so let's listen to what he had to say.
I'm rather critical with regard to my opinion about this expose, but when it comes to the goals of the Polish foreign policy, I can subscribe to some of those mentioned by Mr. Minister. First, active policy towards Ukraine, strengthening our position within the EU and NATO. And when it comes to relations with Russia, of course, we need to deter Russia.
So we've talked about security, but what about other priorities of Poland? Polish Foreign Minister has also touched a little bit about the economy. He said, interestingly, that Poland could soon be joining the G20 group, the group of top 20 biggest economies in the world. He said that we are on the brink of joining that group. But overall, security is the theme for 2025 for Poland, as it has been in the past 12 months. Back to you in the studio.
That's Kazimierz Szweszak live from the Polish Parliament. In the same address, Radosław Sikorski also underlined Poland's defence spending and how Europe is following the country's example. Zuzanna Jurek takes a closer look.
Following Poland's example, European allies are increasing their defence spending, said Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski during a foreign policy address in the Polish Parliament on Wednesday.
The current potential of all NATO member countries calculated in funds spent on defense is nearly 1.5 trillion or $1,500 billion, while Russia's defense budget stands at around 145 billion.
After outlining NATO's collective potential, Sikorski pointed to concrete achievements.
Since 2016, just before Donald Trump came to power, NATO countries, excluding the US, have increased defense spending from $255 billion to $506 billion, or by 98%. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the increase in outlays has further accelerated.
After discussing extensive potential of European defence capabilities, the Polish foreign minister discussed mechanisms to build Europe's defence capacity. This includes the Rearm Fund, a proposal he first floated in February.
The additional billions of euros we will receive from the budget will come from what is known as SAFE, the EU's instrument for enhancing security, or low-interest loans for the security of Europe. This money will be available as part of a pool of 150 billion euros in low-interest EU loans.
According to experts, the funds could be used to support the creation of supply chains desperately needed by European companies.
There are a couple of gaps particularly in space launch capacity and missile technology that will take some time to fill. We're particularly short of missiles to conduct suppression of enemy air defense missions, which would be critical in any conflict with Russia and therefore critical to deterring Russia.
But it may also require a strong public sector guarantees to take off.
If defense industries are given reliable long-term contracts, then they'll be able to invest in expanding production. They do need defense ministries to be able to say, we have a 5 or 10-year program of rearmament and we expect to see a level of orders that would allow you to invest.
According to Polish officials, the first disbursement from the Rearm Fund could reach EU member states by the end of 2025. For TVP World, Zuzanna Jurek.
A no-show from the US Secretary of State has triggered the cancellation of high-level Ukraine peace talks in London. Negotiations continued at a lower level, with the decision prompted by Kyiv's unwillingness to discuss recognising Crimea as Russian territory. At the same time, US Envoy Steve Witkoff is on his way to Moscow to sit down again with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Marek Steele has more.
The only picture posted from the Ukraine ceasefire talks in London. Ukraine's full delegation was present for discussions that were to include counterparts from the United States. But U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio cancelled last minute.
This meeting has been, if I may say, downgraded, right? So everyone understands that it will not be some decisive meeting where something will be signed.
The reason behind the decision to downgrade on the part of the U.S. is Kyiv's refusal to talk about the status of Russian-occupied Crimea.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is boasting on the front page of the Wall Street Journal that Ukraine will not legally recognize the occupation of Crimea. There's nothing to talk about here. This statement is very harmful to the peace negotiations with Russia in that Crimea was lost years ago.
Crimea, it is Ukraine. I love Crimea. I believe that we will have a good result about Crimea, not maybe tomorrow, maybe 3, 5, 10 years. Crimea, it's Ukraine. Trump need immediately result. It is not possible.
According to the Washington Post, the U.S. presented Ukraine with a list of proposals that included recognizing Crimea as Russian. The U.S. also allegedly proposed lifting sanctions against Moscow. In exchange, Russia would end hostilities in Ukraine.
So this is a question about the security guarantees over and over. And again, we haven't heard any single, practical matter of how do you do it from of our allies.
Russian leader Vladimir Putin reportedly offered to halt the invasion along the current front line to U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, who visited Moscow earlier this month. Witkoff will visit the Russian capital again later this week, according to the White House.
When we have a ceasefire agreement, then the territory which is under Russian occupation remains de jure sovereign territory of Ukraine. We're talking about the Crimea and all other territories which are occupied by the Russian Federation.
Although a ceasefire would not create grounds for Russia to claim legal control over the lands, it would create a new de facto border between the two enemy states. U.S. President Donald Trump and his administration are slowly losing patience over the prolonging talks.
We've issued a very explicit proposal to both the Russians and the Ukrainians, and it's time for them to either say yes or for the United States to walk away from this process.
After briefly halting airstrikes for the Easter holidays, Russia resumed its regular operations. A Russian drone attack killed another 9 people in the Dnipropetrovsk region on Wednesday. Marek Steele, TVP World.
We now go to Kyiv, where our correspondent Oz Chatterjee is standing by. Oz, what's the reaction been to the talks in London effectively breaking down, or at least being downgraded?
Well, no reaction so far. The talks went on going between Ukraine's foreign minister and Britain's foreign secretary. So those talks still commence. But the fact that the talks have been downgraded hasn't been remarked upon by Kyiv. The biggest line is, as Marek pointed out in the package before, is Donald Trump talking about Zelensky boasting about Crimea. All of the reporting over the last few days has been confirmed about Crimea from this Truth Social post posted by Donald Trump, talking about Zelensky's unwillingness to cede Crimea. Now, it has to be put in context. Ceding Crimea would go against Ukraine's constitution. The Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian parliament, as it stands, will not change to vote that constitution to allow the ceding of Crimea. And that would be a politically toxic thing to do here in Ukraine. It would be political suicide for any government to attempt to sign a document that would give Russian legitimacy over Crimea. That is something that the Ukrainian people would be very, very angry about and would likely collapse any government. So the idea that Donald Trump is going to be able to force this through onto Zelensky's government is not being borne out by the reaction here in Kyiv so far.
Thank you, Oz. That's Oz Chatterjee, our Ukraine correspondent in Kyiv. Social media giants Meta and Apple are facing hefty fines from the EU over breaches of the bloc's digital rulebook. Amid a simmering transatlantic trade war, the companies have already hit back, saying they are being unfairly targeted. Here to break it all down is EU correspondent Angela Skujins, who's been following this story from Brussels. Good evening, Angela. What are the allegations at play here?
Yes, so the European Commission announced today from Brussels that both of these Silicon Valley social media behemoths, Meta responsible for platforms such as Facebook and Instagram, and Apple responsible for pumping out millions of products like my iPhone here, broke the Digital Markets Act rules. Now, this is legislation aiming to prevent big tech from having a stranglehold on those online marketplaces. This is the first time that any company has been hit by a fine for allegedly breaking these rules. We heard an explanation from a European Commission spokesperson as to what these companies allegedly did. Let's hear this explanation.
Now, Apple is indeed breaching its anti-steering obligations under the DMA by imposing a number of restrictions on app developers to steer their customers to alternative offers outside the Apple App Store. Meta, with its binary pay or consent advertising model, is breaching the DMA obligation to give consumers the choice of a service that uses less of their personal data.
In response, Apple has alleged that the DMA unfairly targets American and Chinese companies, giving an unfair advantage to European traders. Meta has also responded, saying that the changes that company will need to undergo to adhere to the DMA is tantamount to $1 million tariff. Now, this is strong language amid a transatlantic trade war, but we heard the European Commissioner in charge of the economy defending the Commission's decision at a press conference in Washington. Let's take a listen to what that trade chief had to say.
Our Digital Markets Act is in place. It has to be followed by all large online platforms, be it European or foreign platforms. So it's non-discriminatory in this regard. It also doesn't have any extraterritorial effect. It only concerns the conduct of those companies in respect of EU legislation.
So what happens next? Both of these companies have 60 days to pay the fine. If they don't, they'll incur daily penalties thereafter. We've also heard that a representative from Apple stating that they intend to appeal this decision in court. So we'll have to wait and see what happens in terms of the justice system and whether these companies will pay these fines. But that's all from me. I'll send it back to you in Warsaw.
Angela Skujins, our EU correspondent in Brussels. Thank you. Tens of thousands of people are gathering in Rome to mourn the death of Pope Francis. Many of them will pay their respects over the coming days, with his body now lying in state at St Peter's Basilica. At least 250,000 are expected to attend the late pontiff's funeral on Saturday. And joining me live from Rome is our correspondent, Alex Cadier. Good evening, Alex. How has the day developed and what's the mood on the ground?
Good evening, Aaron. Well, you can see behind me a sea of people making up an immense ocean of emotion. We've been speaking to them all day here, hearing their thoughts. People have come from far and wide. People have come from as far as South America. Of course, you would expect that with Pope Francis being the first pope coming from the Americas. It has been a really moving day, a moving time to be here today. We've heard varying opinions about Pope Francis, but everyone has come here to pay their respects. But to a group of Polish students who changed their travel plans on holiday here in Italy to come pay their respects to what they described as our Pope. Some very strong emotions as we saw the Pope laying in state. He will be in St. Peter's Basilica behind me until midnight for worshippers to come pay their final goodbyes. The legacy of Pope Francis will be one of a reformer who promoted women into leadership roles within the Catholic Church, who also changed the narrative amongst the Catholic leadership about LGBT people. There's been a reaction to that today. We heard that, some positive feedback, but some questions certainly about his role in his statements about the war in Ukraine, an ambiguous, ambivalent role at times which had been criticized. Nevertheless, we heard from one student, you'll hear from him in a moment, about that position. You will hear from Jan, who is a Polish law student, talking to us about that, and Konrad, also a Polish student, explaining his emotions, and finally Maureen, a Dutch tourist, talking about what she wants to see for the future of the papacy. Let's have a listen to what they had to say.
He helped them a lot, but in the same time he wanted to be a diplomat. He didn't want to say that we need to condemn Russians for what they did, but he was speaking about, we need to pray for the end of this war, etc., etc.
I have, of course, hope about future, and so this is my main emotion about this situation.
I do know that he supports more women's rights than the Pope's usual previous ones, and I think that's a really good thing. I hope the next one will also be feministic and supporting LGBTQ rights and be more progressive.
So some of the views there expressed that we've seen with this outpouring of emotion here in Rome. There will be more in the coming days, with hundreds of thousands coming to say their final goodbye. Aaron.
And we'll have special coverage here on TVP World on Saturday of Pope Francis's funeral. Alex, thanks so much for coming to us from Rome. Some of Europe's key financial players are gathering in southwestern Poland as they aim to combat Donald Trump's tariff turbulence. It comes in the same week that the International Monetary Fund slashed its growth forecast. Sasha Farbach has more.
Top leaders from across Europe are converging in Katowice for the 17th European Economic Congress, where energy, digitalization, and economic resilience are taking center stage. The list of political and economic challenges is growing, with the IMF's recent global growth downgrade.
And it's hitting all the regions of the world. We're seeing lower growth in the US, lower growth in the euro area, lower growth in China, lower growth in other parts of the world.
The International Monetary Fund's recent downgrade has shaken the global economy, slashing growth expectations to just 2.8%. The U.S. is projected to grow at a mere 1.8%, while Germany stagnates at 0%. Key CEE economies are also feeling the pressure, with Poland revised to 3.2% growth and Romania and the Czech Republic both at 1.6%. Despite these challenges, experts remain hopeful about Poland's ability to navigate the uncertainty.
I think arguably Poland is relatively protected from a lot of these changes. It has quite a diversified economy. It has a diversified network of trading partners.
The summit in southwestern Poland seeks to provide solutions as the world grapples with the impact of Trump's tariffs and uncertainty surrounding Ukraine's future. Experts are divided on the best course of action for Poland and the region in tackling issues ahead.
We need to remember that the US is not our prime partner in trade, and we need to enhance our potential with trading alongside with our partners from the European Union. For example, with our partners like Germany, France or Italy.
Speaking to TVP World, former Polish Prime Minister Jan Bielecki discussed Poland's inclusion on the US's green list of countries as a possible solution.
If you are green, then they recognize you as a friendly country with additional military support provided. So it means a lower tariff and a lot of security important for future business development.
While Poland has shown resilience in weathering the storm, key sectors like automotive and steel remain vulnerable. With Trump's tariff turbulence and an uncertain peace deal in Ukraine, the road ahead could still be rocky for both the region and the world. Sasha Farbach, TVP World.
Ukraine peace talks appear to be in political limbo. US Vice President JD Vance is threatening a total walkout if Ukraine and Russia can't agree on terms. Meanwhile, America's Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, suddenly pulled out of planned negotiations in London. The abrupt U-turn prompted a lower level of conversations behind closed doors, but it again leaves the region uncertain over what the US might do next. With me in the studio now is Louis Verenga, lecturer in international relations at the Baltic Defence College. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
So where does this leave us? Is the US really looking at pulling the pin?
You know, it's hard to say. I know that one could look at what the U.S. administration is doing and actually say, okay, maybe they are doing that. But the thing about the administration is that it's led by a president who drives a hard bargain. He doesn't tilt his strategic hand, and you never know if it's a power play where he's trying to get one side or both sides to achieve his objectives. So with a lot of things, wait and see. Now, it's tough to wait and see when there's an ongoing war of aggression and the aggressor is not necessarily being treated as such. And so that creates tension not just with the Ukrainian president and Ukrainian people, but also with other allies and partners. So I don't think so. I'd like to say that the answer to that question is no, but this is the Trump administration really trying to untie the Gordian knot, let's say.
And you mentioned the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky there. He says that we're in a dangerous moment. Is he right?
Absolutely, because and it's been said by policy experts and politicians and strategic thinkers since the start of the second phase of Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine that other autocrats are watching, and that if this is allowed to continue and it is continuing. And if it is not checked and it is not punished, that's going to send a message to other countries that might think of doing a similar or the same type of thing that, well, if we just wait it out, we can get away with it, especially if the countries possess nuclear weapons so that they can engage in nuclear blackmail. So, of course, this is about Ukraine, this is about Europe, this is about, liberal democratic countries versus autocracies. So the right message needs to be sent, and right now that message took a slight detour with the way that these negotiations are being currently handled and what is being said. Now, one little caveat with that is that what's being made public does not necessarily need to equate with what's going on behind closed doors, and I think we'd all like to think that in such an engagement at that level, there's a lot of things that aren't being said while the details are being hashed out.
Keith Kellogg did still meet with the Ukrainian delegation in London today, so to prove your point that there are discussions still happening behind closed doors. Steve Witkoff on his way to Moscow as well. How much would you read into Marco Rubio not going to London then? Is it as big a deal that, look, you've got JD Vance also making comments to say they might pull out, this is kind of the beginning of the end? Or is this just more power politics, to the point you made at the beginning?
I think it's the latter. I think part of it is a statement that it's not necessarily going to be on the highest or the second highest level, but they did send somebody. They did send the Ukraine envoy. Now, the Middle East envoy is, of course, going to Moscow to meet with Vladimir Putin, but Keith Kellogg went. Apparently, Marco Rubio yesterday had a phone call with his British counterpart, Minister David Lammy, and they spoke, and the U.S. has people there that are talking to the Ukrainians and to the Europeans. So you could read into that as just a power play to send the message that, hey, this administration calls the shots, and if these demands and if these asks are not met, then this is how we're going to change course.
Much of the back and forth surrounds Zelensky refusing to accept recognition of Crimea as Russian territory following the 2014 annexation. Can you just outline for the layperson, why is this land so important?
Well, it's so important because it's Ukrainian territory. So, first of all, and President Zelensky was correct, allowing for that territory to go to Russia violates the Ukrainian constitution. That's number one. And number two, why should they have to give up a land that was taken away from them in the first phase of the invasion? I mean, it's known as the illegal annexation of the Crimean Peninsula for that reason. And second of all, it goes back to the point that I made earlier. If that is allowed to be hashed out and set in stone in a peace agreement, disregarding the fact, keeping in mind that that agreement could be broken by the Russians at any point in time. I mean, we'd have to see what a real hard security guarantee is. It's loss of land, and that means that an aggressor is allowed to get away with that. So that is why it is so very important that Ukraine keeps control over their own territory, which includes the Crimean Peninsula.
What happens if both sides do say no and America does pull out of talks? How does Ukraine defend itself? Especially, let's say, military aid is withdrawn.
Well, that would be unfortunate.
Is that worst case scenario?
I think that it is worst case scenario, because what Europe has demonstrated is that they are willing. The British Prime Minister speaks very, very frequently to President Zelensky, and he has said that support for Ukraine is ironclad, and they are really in this for the long haul. And you see countries like Poland, like the Baltic states, like the Nordic countries, even France, for example, really saying, this is European territory, even if it's not an EU member state, even if it's not a NATO member state, this is Europe, and we're not going to allow this to happen. The issue there is that right now, the change in security environment that Europe is really starting to face, that takes time, and time is something that we don't have already now, and we would have even less of it if the U.S. decides to pull out. And I think that the Trump administration knows this. I think they realize that, and I think that that is one of their bargaining chips. They're just saying, hey, you know what, you actually need us, so we're going to do it our way. And that is the Gordian knot, because they've essentially told the Ukrainians a week ago, they had this this deal where basically they have to cede a lot of territory. EU membership is okay, but NATO membership is a no-go. So the Ukraine is not getting the winning chips in this scenario. So now this is where diplomacy is going to be really put to the test.
A question closer to home. It is related, though. Polish Foreign Minister Sikorski today effectively warning Russia away from reigniting its age of imperialism and equally noting that, and I quote, the greatest threat to Poland would be the collapse of the Western community. What did you make of his address?
He's right, and it's good for him to say that, and it needs to be said, and it needs to be said by as many people as possible and as frequently as possible, because that really would be a catastrophe. And right now, as I mentioned, this region of Europe is one thing that is physically and politically standing in the way of that happening. Now, it's become very, very clear to people who sort of missed the boat on this that, well, a lot of the world was focusing on non-state actors. State actors were engaging in a buildup, and then you see this throughout the timeline from 2007 all the way up to 2022 and now with Russia, so that they're going to continue this if left unchecked. And that also gets back to an earlier point that we were discussing this evening, that if that territory is lost, that's a check in the imperial box, and that's a minus in the European liberal democratic box, and we can't allow that to happen. So it was really good, I think, that the Polish foreign minister stressed that the way that he did.
Louis Wierdianga, lecturer in international relations at the Baltic Defence College, thank you again for your time.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And that's all for World News tonight. But stay with us, because On the Record is coming up after a short break. Adam Yasser, joined by Yulia Zeskina, legal expert on war reparations, and Bill Browder, a former prominent investor in Russia, who now calls doing business in Russia insanity. Don't go anywhere. I'm Aaron Darman. Have a very good evening indeed.